Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. On the 26th of last month, India commemorated the 19th anniversary of the Kargil Vijay Divas, the day when Indian soldiers pushed back the Pakistani intruders from the Kargil heights. Year after year, on the Kargil Vijay Divas or the Kargil Victory Day, the Indian politicians pay homage to the fallen soldiers at Kargil who safeguarded India's sovereignty and security and integrity. However, year after year, they forget to implement the much needed defense reforms in order to improve and strengthen the efficiency and the strength of the Indian armed forces. Various committees since the Kargil war, the K. Subramaniam Committee, the Group of Ministers Committee have actually highlighted the importance of jointness and jointmanship in the Indian military and have recommended to the successive governments in order to implement defense reforms in general and jointmanship in particular in the Indian armed forces. So 19 years since the Kargil war, where are we with the jointness in the Indian armed forces? So today we will be discussing the state of jointness and jointmanship in the Indian military. To discuss jointmanship and jointness in the Indian military, I have with me in the studio Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam. Arjun Subramaniam served in the Indian Air Force for 30 years and he recently retired. He was until recently a visiting fellow at the Oxford University and will now be teaching at the Fletcher School in the United States. He is today a celebrated author, having authored 3 very important books on India's military history. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, AVM Saab.
Thank you, Happy Moon. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss what I think is a very critical issue.
Let me begin by asking, why is jointness desirable in a military? But before I think you answer that, it would be useful if you can tell our viewers what is jointness all about. So what is jointness in military affairs and why is jointness desirable?
Okay. A very simple way of looking at how jointness is important is that if you look at the combat capability of arms individually with an index of say 1. So it's 1 plus 1 plus 1 is equal to 3 in case each service executes its missions and its tasks individually.
Right.
But the moment the missions and tasks are executed together, 1 plus 1 plus 1 doesn't become 3 but it becomes 6. That's the exponential power of integration, of interoperability, of working together in pursuit of a common security objective. Now, that's a simplistic way of looking at jointness. But a more systemic way of looking at jointness is that particularly at a time when resources are becoming exceedingly scarce, and you want to derive the maximum bang for the buck, it's important that all 3 services synergize their strengths, cater to each other's weaknesses, and therefore deliver an optimum output that is desirable for national security. So that to my mind is a very simple, broad explanation of why jointness is important in today's extremely complex times.
What does it involve? I mean, at the basic level, when you have jointness in a military organization or 3 wings of the armed forces, what does it really involve at the brass tacks level?
Okay, at the brass tacks, it basically involves understanding each other's capabilities, understanding each other's limitations, understanding each other's roles and tasks, discussing how best these roles and tasks, if looked at with a single-minded purpose, can actually lead to better delivery. And it involves understanding each other's history, it involves training together, it involves leading together, it involves educating one another together, so that over a period of time, the 3 actually become one. Commonality of purpose, commonality of vision, commonality of capability.
Right.
That is what jointness involves.
But is that universally understood to be something that is desirable? I've just looked at the neighborhood. The Pakistanis don't have jointness, for example. China does have. So what is the state of jointness universally, globally, as it is practiced or not practiced in various countries?
Very interesting, because I was quite sure that this would come up a little later in the discussion, but I'm glad that you brought out. Jointness actually has evolved over a period of time as a horses for courses policy. And that is what the Indian military also talks about. You cannot thrust down a US model or a British model or a French model or a Chinese model on the Indian armed forces. The Indian armed forces have to evolve their own brand of jointmanship based on their combined performances in battle and history, the imperatives of the present, and the challenges of the future. And that is jointness from an Indian context. So if somebody tells me that, look, the US armed forces reformed because of Vietnam, it was a top-down approach, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, it was an overreaching reform, that was what the United States with its DNA felt was required to completely transform the armed forces. Pakistan is an overwhelmingly army-dominated or an army-centric country. There's no question of the other two services even expecting any share of the pie. The Air Force and the Navy do what the Pakistan Army wants them to do.
But that's a security state. One would expect a certain amount of cost cutting and efficiency and optimization of resources in Pakistan.
I don't think so. I don't think resource optimization is a problem in Pakistan. Everything else can sort of languish. But the Pakistan military capability, for whatever it's worth, will not languish.
What about China? What sort of spurred these reforms in the Chinese context?
You see, in the Chinese context, what Hu Jintao to a certain extent, but actually Xi Jinping to a great extent, realized that the Chinese armed forces or the PLA was an exceedingly PLA-dominated force, was bloated, was excessively land-centric, was not paying enough attention to the potential of both maritime and air power. And when that realization came, and for China, you must remember that China does everything with the United States in focus.
Right.
Everything.
Right.
And the United States relies overwhelmingly on combat power delivered from the air, from maritime forces, with the land component actually delivering the final, the land component in the US plan of things is extremely important.
It's the final blow.
It's the final blow. But the contribution of air power and other peripheral combat power is increasingly important. Space, cruise missiles.
So China is implementing these reforms.
China is implementing
with the US in mind.
With the US in mind. Anything that China is doing right now is aimed at sort of blunting the overwhelming operational superiority that the US armed forces have at present.
In other words, the Chinese have woken up to the external challenges that they are facing.
Yep.
The Indians don't seem to have woken up to the external challenges that we are facing. What explains this lack of jointness in the Indian military? You say in your book, India's Wars, that a joint warfighting perspective is missing in India's recorded war history. You also argue that the Indian military's performance in terms of joint warfighting capability remains suboptimal.
Yeah, suboptimal.
Can you explain that to me?
Yeah. So if you look at it, if you look at the fine print of what I talk about a desirable end state. I talk about a bit of a disappointment, but there's no despair. If you notice in my writing, there is no despair. There is no despair because in spite of these roadblocks, the three services in India have always delivered at crunch time. Now, you will argue that they've delivered, but could they have done it better?
And bang for the bucks.
Yes,
as you
and I
put
say
it.
yes, and I say yes. So, my disappointment or my aspiration for India's armed forces is that why should jointmanship emerge from adversity? Why should jointmanship emerge when we have been first pushed against the wall and then the resilience and the fighting capacity of India's armed forces has ensured that you've pushed back, and you've pushed back to ensure that that sovereignty has been protected, that there have been victories. But like I said, there is a sense of disappointment that maybe having had so many experiences in the past, maybe the change should be much faster right now, considering that geopolitics are changing so fast, the nature of warfare is changing so fast. There is a need for a greater bang for the buck.
So what explains? So there is this external forces that are evolving the way they are evolving, and I'm sure the Indian strategic thinkers are sort of waking up to these realities. So where lies the problem?
Okay.
What explains the absence of jointness?
Firstly, it would be rather harsh to say there is a lack of jointness.
Okay. Are you talking about the ideas?
No, not ideas. I'm also talking about the manner in which India's armed forces execute plans, draw up operational plans. Compared to 20 years ago, I mean to say I served for 35 years, and I can see from year 1 to year 35, the extent of jointness in our planning, in our ability to talk to one another amongst the services has increased manifold. So there are two prisms that you can look at it. One prism is if you say that at a point in time in the past, say 1965 war, from then to now, if you look at it, there has been significant progress.
Yeah, it's better today, but not yet good.
No.
So what is preventing this good from coming into being? That's my question.
Yeah, okay. There's another thing that these days gets me a little worried, and that is, you mentioned about the group of ministers report, you mentioned about the KRC, the Kargil Review Committee, you mentioned about the Naresh Chandra Committee report, very robust report, and of course the Shekatkar Committee, which has now suggested incremental changes at the middle level and not exactly at the top. What troubles me about jointness? All these committees all recommended a top-down approach. The world over, jointness within the national security establishment is a top-down initiative. And when I say top-down, it means that if reform is required across the tiers of the national security establishment, we need to have the courage to be able to execute those reforms across the board and not piecemeal.
What does that mean?
Okay. All these committees suggested either a CDS or a Chairman Chiefs of Staff Committee. They suggested a restructuring of the Ministry of Defence to display actual jointness, which means to say that the Ministry of Defence to be staffed by both bureaucrats and military personnel, so that there is objective and analytical debate while decisions are being taken.
But these are two different schools of thought, right? You have the bureaucrats and you have the military men and women.
Yeah.
If they are staffed together in one headquarters, how does that help? Can you please explain?
Oh, it does help. Like for example, when we went to all military headquarters across the world which have restructured, have this combination. And the combination works extremely well. Firstly, adequate checks and balances, diversity of views, diversity of opinions, and that leads to better policy advice to policymakers. What happens now? That the RM asks for an opinion or an analysis of an issue, it goes to the bureaucrat sends it to the service headquarters, the service headquarters do their own in-house brainstorming, do their own in-house activity and send the file up back to the Ministry of Defence. Now, the final word on that file now is back with the bureaucrat. And then he puts in his comments and it goes to the Raksha Mantri. There is no collegiate or there is no collegial discussion about matters related to national security before policy suggestions are made.
In other words, you would say that it is preferable probably to have a joint secretary in the MOD or an additional secretary in the MOD from the Navy, Army or the Air Force, and various rungs of the organization should be staffed
exactly.
with
like for example, I don't see if you have a defense secretary who dialogues and works alongside the CDS or the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. If you have an additional secretary who's a bureaucrat, I don't see any reason why you can't have a joint secretary as a two-star officer.
Right.
So I'm talking about this concept which is called cross-pollination.
Right.
And cross-pollination is extremely powerful.
Okay, let's look at the present situation as it exists today.
Yeah.
Today we have the chairman Chiefs of Staff Committee. We do have the headquarters integrated defense staff.
Yep.
What is problematic about this, and why do we need, say, something like the Chief of Defense Staff or more integration?
Okay.
What is the problem with this?
Let me look at it a little differently. India's armed forces are comprised of the big gorilla in the room, which is the Indian Army, 1.2 million strong. And you have the Air Force and the Navy, which are significantly smaller in size, primarily in size. Now, most of our conflicts, ongoing ones as well as in the past, have emanated along continental boundaries, along our land frontiers. The Indian Army of the three services continues to remain extensively preoccupied and engaged in counterinsurgency and proxy war, hybrid war in J&K.
Okay.
The Northeast, the army is still engaged. The levels of violence may have dropped, but the army still remains deployed because of the latent possibility of insurgencies re-erupting in case presence is diluted. So therefore, notwithstanding whatever strategists say that today's conflict is more about stress in the maritime domain, air power is a significant enabler and things like that, the big gorilla in the room still feels that for some time to come, the Indian Army is going to be still the main, what do you call,
The mainstay of the Indian defense.
the mainstay of the Indian Defence Forces. That's, nobody tells that to me. The Chief of the Army Staff will not say that.
But that's a feeling, that's a philosophical underpinning of...
But that's my impression from years and years of interacting and engaging with the Indian Army and having studied them so closely. Now, but having said that, the Indian Army over the years is extremely cognizant about the capabilities of air power, and that in any high intensity, limited, short war, unlike Kargil, air power will have to shape the environment before the army goes in.
Absolutely.
And therefore, if you notice over the years, the amount of jointness between the army and the air force has increased significantly. I don't know whether you followed exercise Gagan Shakti. Exercise Gagan Shakti, which the Air Force conducted, was more about jointness than about anything else.
So they are waking up to the realizing.
Absolutely. So jointness, like I told you, there is no one size fits all.
But you would say that this is not yet enough.
No,
you need
it's
a
not.
lot more of it.
No.
But let me ask you a different question. We did discuss a CDS issue.
Yeah.
Why do you need to have a Chief of Defence Staff? Is it not better to have decision making by consensus, which is what happens in the Chiefs of Staff Committee?
Okay. Now,
give me an argument why it should be implemented, why we should have a CDS.
the argument which all the committees offered for a CDS, single point military contact to the political leadership. That is the raison d'etre for a CDS. Now, are we ready for a CDS? Are we ready for CDS right now? I don't think so. But are we ready for a chairman of the joint chiefs with greater operational responsibility? I think so.
Okay.
For example, why can't one give more teeth to the Andaman Nicobar Command? What prevents a chairman? We are comfortable in India, whether it is all establishment, all tools of statecraft. We are comfortable with incremental changes. we are not, for the Indian establishment, clerical widespread changes are something which will be sort of cataclysmic.
But don't you think it's a little too slow? I mean, since Kargil, 19 years, all we have today is in terms of jointness to show for, all we have is the Andaman Nicobar Theatre Command, and we have the nuclear the nuclear command. And IDS is, I mean, it's not one of those most useful.
Again, I would say useful. It's a useful interface, but again suboptimal.
The fact that you have a 2-star officer in the IDS?
No, 3-star.
3-star
Army commander equivalent.
Army commander equivalent, but not someone who can tell the Chiefs of Staff Committee what to do, can only advise.
Oh yes, like for example, from what I gather in the open domain, and I've been following him on Twitter and things like that, the current CISC is quite vocal and active in his attempts at enhancing jointness.
Right, so we have made some progress towards jointness, but a lot more jointness needs to happen. Where is the opposition coming from? Is that a philosophical issue? Is that a political issue? Or is that a organizational problem? Where is the resistance to enhanced jointness in the Indian military coming from?
A little bit of everything. Most defense reforms in the West, as well as in China, have been driven right from the top.
That's right.
Okay. And it's driven right from the top when the highest policy-making body or the highest political leader in the country feels a decisive need to intervene and impact the trajectory of the growth of an organization. And when that happens, it's a top-driven approach.
There has to be political will.
There has to, I wouldn't even call it political will. There has to be enhanced political interest in matters military.
Okay. But that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, I guess, is also the lack of enthusiasm from within the various arms of the Indian military itself. I mean, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. How serious or enthusiastic are they about jointness? It's about turf wars. It's about losing your own say in matters that are exclusive to you.
You see, turf battles is when one talks about integration. Okay. The Navy is relatively sanguine in its belief that come what may, naval deployments, naval disposition, distribution of naval assets will not be very different from what it exists presently. They can't be taken out from the sea. There is nobody who knows the sea better than a maritime person.
Correct.
So whether there is an integrated theatre command or whether there is a task force, the naval element of the task force goes nowhere else other than the seas. And the threat from the sea, as far as India is concerned, is also very, very clear. Our primary focus is the Indian Ocean region, and our peripheral focus extends a little bit into the Pacific. This whole argument about India being involved in the Indo-Pacific domain is a bit of a misnomer. The Indo-Pacific, as far as India is concerned, mainly is the Indian Ocean region.
Interesting.
And the Pacific element is merely a corollary that India would like to influence, but does not have the capability to do so.
Right.
Okay. The Army is absolutely certain that as long as we have stressed borders, their formations are going nowhere. Command and control over those formations are going nowhere. Now we come to the uncertain animal in the room. And I myself am an Air Force officer, but I say uncertain because if there is a service that is truly joint in terms of its capability and in terms of its performance, it is the Air Force. The Air Force, except for a few aerial battles of its own, anything the Air Force does impacts either maritime operations or impacts ground operations. Correct? The impact of air power in contemporary warfare is disproportionate. which means to say no army will move into a tactical battle area unless that battle area has been softened by aerial attack. It's called shaping the battlefield.
So what happens because of the increasing prominence of the Air Force?
Yeah.
How does that impact on the
rivalry within? So therefore, when there are talks of Air Force assets being divided amongst various theatres, the Air Force says, hey, look, we have finite resources. The Indian Air Force is a small Air Force. It has got severe resource crunches currently, 30 squadrons against an established squadron of 42. It has only a finite number of force enablers, which means to say force enablers are actually aerial refuelers, AWACS, electronic warfare aircraft and things like that. In a US theatre, each theatre has its own complement of every kind of aerial resource.
So this concern, this worry of the IAF
Yes.
is preventing it from supporting,
From fully
enhance-
supporting. From fully, in the
Fully
sense,
support,
yeah.
okay.
What the Air Force says is, you let us know what is the joint requirement. And we will be there. We will contribute wholeheartedly. And then the Air Force offers the argument.
But it doesn't want to divide its resources.
Exactly. It doesn't want to divide its resources because of ownership issues, but because of capability issues.
But the Air Force is also a little concerned about the whole CDS issue. Why is that? I hear that Air Force is not too enthusiastic.
No, the Air Force was in the past vehemently resistant to the CDS concept. It is now not resistant to the CDS concept, but adds a rider, but argues. The Air Force has argued very, very consistently that we cannot have piecemeal reform.
Right. Okay.
We cannot have a CDS with no reform in the MOD. We should not have theatre commands if there isn't reform elsewhere.
Okay, I got it.
So what the Air Force says is that the talk of the hour is a whole of government approach. When you talk about governance, when you talk about diplomacy, it's very easy everyone talks about whole of government approach. The whole of government approach should also translate to matters related to restructuring of the military.
Let's come to the political class.
Yeah.
Is there a fear within the Indian political class about a single point military advisor, the Chief of Defence Staff? You're a military historian,
Yeah.
and although the Indian Prime Minister in 2015 stated at the Joint Commanders Conference that he would strive towards enriching the jointmanship in the Indian military, etc., etc. There has not been much progress in this direction. But going back into history, the Chief of Staff of the British Army, Lord Ismay, did recommend the establishment of a Chief of Defence Staff. Mountbatten did write to Desai and Nehru. So there was this recognition in the Indian strategic mind that there is a need for greater integration and sort of the importance of a Chief of Defence Staff.
The Indian strategic establishment was quite certain that it would like to watch and observe what's going on in the neighborhood before deciding on what to do with the structure of military organization. And with what was going on around in the neighborhood, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is Indonesia and all these places, there is no doubt in my mind that Nehru was pretty certain that civilian supremacy over the armed forces is essential to maintain Indian democracy, to protect Indian democracy. Now, whether he was right or wrong, well, I believe that he was wrong because the Indian general, right, whether it was Thimmaiya or whether it was Cariappa, were too professional to harbor any ambitions of political power. And there's another thing that I think the political establishment of the time, the Nehru era, overestimated the general's capacity to govern a nation as diverse as India.
So historically speaking, you are saying that there was a certain element of fear within the Indian political class about military taking a more proactive role in the state of affairs in India.
Exactly.
But do you think, fundamentally speaking, more jointness or the appointment of a CDS has implications for civil-military relations in India, objectively looking at it?
No, I don't think so. Once again,
It's more fear than...
Once again, you see, it's a question of looking at India's cultural and social fabric. Such a large nation, so many ethnicities, so many cultures, so many religions, and more importantly, the distance. You can't, I mean to say, if you look at military dictatorships, they've all concentrated in small countries.
Right.
Because military dictatorships rely on control. Control of population through coercion. You can't, I mean to say, you can't control a country like India through coercion. I'm just the democratic experiment in India has been actually spectacular, and the armed forces have played an extremely critical role in the enrichment of that democracy. And that has been my argument, and that remains my argument even in my sequel, that the Indian military has not got the recognition it deserves for the development of Indian democracy.
Interesting. So you would say the fears about civil-military relations being adversely impacted by more jointness or CDS is misplaced?
Misplaced, completely unfounded.
Let's come to the question of joint doctrines.
Yeah.
The joint. How do you evaluate the joint doctrines that India has published? I think two of them in the with training doctrine and the other one. What are the flaws with these doctrines?
Yeah.
Are they sort of put together, having done enough inter-service consultation and consultation with the civilians?
The plain answer is no.
So what happens when you?
I'll tell you what happened. I've been associated with doctrinal work for much of my service career, for much of my senior service career.
Right.
And our joint doctrines are not joint; they are joined.
Okay.
There is a difference between joint and joined.
That's right.
You ask for inputs from X, you ask for inputs from Y, you ask for inputs from Z. And then you compile them and you collate them according to a broad framework that you've already decided.
That is what you call joined.
Joined.
So what should be a joint doctrine be?
Joint doctrine, again, a joint doctrine can only flow out of very, very clear policy objectives and policy guidelines. And those policy objectives and policy guidelines do not exist beyond the Raksha Mantri's op directive. The Raksha Mantri issues an operational directive to the three services based on which operational plans are made and strategies are made. But that's not enough.
What happens to these doctrines once they are developed? Are they sort of do they inhere into the culture and socialization of the armed forces, or they remain as doctrines?
No. To be fair to our institutions of professional military education and things like that, doctrines are widely disseminated.
And what about the joint doctrines?
Joined doctrines. Yeah, that's also widely disseminated. But if I don't know, you must have read the critique about the joint doctrine from Abhijnan Reg from ORF. And Shashank Joshi, they have dissected the Indian joint doctrine pretty brutally.
And what do you think of that?
You know, in the sense that was a bit over the top. But that is a point that you have to listen to. You see, again, what's happened is, and which I'm a big advocate of, is that I'm so glad that so many academics and so many young researchers are taking interest in understanding Indian military doctrine, critiquing it. And if you're young, you will be brutal in your critique.
And one should be.
One should be.
And you are a scholar now, you realize the importance of academics ripping these things apart.
Absolutely. So I am hopeful that the next joint doctrine will be a much more robust document when it comes out, and I'm also certain that there would be a lot of inputs coming in from the external environment also, with scholars being roped in order to sort of make it a robust doctrine. So necessary sort of argumentative stuff in order to be able to comment on it.
Let me ask you one more tricky question, and that's my last question.
Okay.
As an Air Force officer and as a scholar, what do you think of the recent decision, the Narendra Modi government's decision to purchase the Rafale aircraft?
Well, the Rafale is a magnificent aircraft.
But no, the decision itself, as opposed to 126, you're looking at about 36 aircraft, and all controversy surrounding that.
Yeah, you see, the controversies, the controversies are entirely political in nature.
Okay.
Entirely political in nature. It has nothing to do with the capability of the platform. It has nothing to do with the requirements of the Indian Air Force. Yes, obviously the Indian Air Force must be disappointed that it is not getting 126 Rafale, but it is getting 36. But when you look at it in terms of the amount of money available in the defense budget, obviously the Modi government has thought out very carefully that the security environment in the region merits the defense budget shrinking as it has done. Well, I don't agree with it. It's probably at amongst its lowest levels. But there has been a thought behind reduction in the.
But you're looking at the next 30 to 40 years,
Yeah.
and 126 is probably something that you require more than 36.
Yeah.
As an Air Force officer, don't you think you need more numbers?
Yeah, we need more numbers. Those numbers are expected to be made up by the LCA. Those numbers are expected to be made up by the new contract that is going to come up. And you must remember one thing. What would have been at the back of the government would also have been that the Indian Air Force has this propensity, it's demonstrated it again and again, of doing more with less.
Right. Okay.
And therefore, the government would have assessed, saying that, yes, there is an immediate need for some cutting edge platforms. We'll give them 2 squadrons, and we are confident that they will exploit it to the best possible.
But the problem with that argument, AVM Saab, is this: if we think that more jointness requires more resources, you certainly need more platforms. You need a lot more.
Not really.
You did mention that in one of your answers.
Yeah.
That there is a fear in the Indian Air Force of its resources getting divided into theatre commands.
But I have another suggestion as to how we can incrementally improve jointness without having theatre commands till the resource crunch is resolved. You can still have things like allocate more resources to the Andaman Nicobar Command. You can still have the creation of joint task forces wherein the 3 services actually operate for large parts of the years together, gain experience, and then move on to the next step. So I'm not saying that the Indian Air Force is happy with what it's getting. But the fact is the Indian Air Force has to make do with what it is getting. Because in the decision matrix or in the scheme of things, development and economic issues that currently are paramount as far as the Modi government is concerned.
AVM sir, my final question. Okay. All 3 of your books did very well. So what is the book that you're going to work on now? What's the next book?
Okay, let me just correct you over here. Of the 3 books, 2 books primarily deal with my experiences in the Air Force.
Right.
Okay. The first one is a leadership reckoner. It's called Reflections of an Air Warrior. The second one is called Wider Horizons, in which I argue that that military officers need to expand their intellectual horizons. And India's Wars is the real military history book. And I'm working on the sequel, looking at war and conflict in contemporary India from 1972 to current times.
Excellent.
And I've done a fair bit of writing on that.
Good luck with that.
Thank you very much.
AVM, wonderful talking to you.
Thank you very much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.